Okay, today we're going to be talking about a rational decision-making model. In a business, you're going to have to make a lot of decisions. And if you or the team that you work with can agree on a process, it's going to make things a lot easier. Here is one possible system or process that you can use. So this is a systematic process that will help you define the problem, look at all the alternatives, evaluate them, and then finally choose the solution that's going to provide the maximum benefits to you and your org or you and your employees, So this is a 6-step model. The first step is to define the problem. Next, you're going to identify the decision criteria. So what are the most important factors to consider when you're looking and evaluating solutions? Next, you need to weigh the criteria. Are all the factors equally important? Are some more important than others? Assign them a numerical weight. 4, here's when you finally start generating possible alternatives and solutions. There is a tendency to do this step first, but don't. Wait. First, you want to agree on certain things. You want to agree on what is most important and just how important it is. So wait to do the brainstorming until step 4. But once you get to step 4, you look at all the solutions, you look at the ones that are viable, and you start to evaluate them according to the criteria that you previously looked at. Once you do this, finally, the last step is you just compute the optimal decision. So we're going to run through an example, and here's the example question. Some people work in person, some people work remote. What should we adopt as a work policy? Okay, let's run through it. The first step is to define the problem. Here's a quote from a smart guy. If I were given 1 hour to save the planet, I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it. So maybe we can take that to heart. First of all, are we sure this is really a problem? Or is this something that maybe just bugs us? Or maybe does it just bug our boss because our boss is older and they grew up in a time when everybody came into the office, and so that's their norm. Maybe it doesn't bother anybody else. Is this the right problem? Or is there some kind of more macro or more meta problem behind what we think is the problem? And if so, how can you identify what the actual source of the problem is? One way you can do this is through using the 5 whys technique. This was identified by Toyota. And it works like this. You state the problem and then you say why. And once you do this 5 times in a row, generally you get to the true root of the problem. So let's try it with this. First, why? Why is it a problem that some people work remote and some people work in person? Answer. Remote employees feel like they're being overlooked. By the way, this is pretty true. This happens a lot in remote work. Second, why? Why do they feel like they're being overlooked? Answer. Well, they feel that in-person employees are being promoted more often. By the way, this is also true. Third, why? So why are they being promoted more often? Answer. Well, there's just a lot of informal FaceTime that happens around the office. People grab each other in the hallway, people go and get lunch, and this informal FaceTime builds familiarity and trust. So when managers are thinking, who do I really trust, they're just thinking about the people that are there in the office. Okay, fourth, why? So why is that a problem? Answer. Because managers shouldn't be relying on subjective things like visibility for promotion, right? That's just unfair. There should be objective, predefined metrics for assessing employees. Maybe that's the way you feel. Other people may not feel that way. That's fine. Fifth, why? Okay, but why is that fairness even important? You said it's unfair. Why is fairness important? Answer. It is a core organizational value for our company. We want our employees to feel like they're being treated fairly. Okay, by asking 5 whys, by going through this process, asking why 5 times, we're able to get to this root of the problem. And allowing some people to work remote and some people to work in person, or requiring some people to work in person maybe, that can really feel unfair to people. And that's maybe why you got to solve this problem. Okay, so once you have decided this is the right problem and you've defined it, you need to identify the decision criteria. What are the factors that should be used when you're evaluating all the possible solutions? Okay, so for this problem, let's just brainstorm, right? Maybe it affects employee productivity. Maybe it affects the morale of your employees and their retention. So that might affect your turnover, right? Maybe it affects your ability to attract talent. Maybe there are certain operational costs that are associated with this, right? Maybe if everybody's working from home, you can lease a smaller office, or maybe you don't have to spend as much power turning on the lights, I guess. Finally, there might be certain tasks that are harder to do remotely, like collaboration and innovation. And so you want to take that into account too, right? And last, let's say company culture. Can you maintain a company culture if everybody's off in their own space and there's really not a lot of interaction? How do you do that, right? Maybe you just don't know how. Maybe you feel like you can't do it. Okay, so once you get all of these, you're going to weigh the criteria. And the first step is to put them into a table. Once you get them in a table, you're going to assign them a numerical importance score. And this is just if you think it's really important, it gets a higher score. If you think it's less important, it gets a lower score. So let's plug in some examples here. Maybe we feel like employee productivity is the very most important thing, right? We'll give it 10 points. Next, morale, retention, that's pretty important. We'll give it 8. Talent attraction, I actually don't think that's too big of a problem for us. People like to work here regardless, so we'll give it a 4. Operational costs, a little bit more important. We can save some real money here if we cut our lease. And let's say collaboration and innovation, that's super important to us. And company culture is also pretty important to us. So we're going to give those scores of 9 and 8 respectively. Okay, add them all up. You have the subtotal 45. You can just do this by points, or you can add up the points at the end and divide by this 45 to get like a percentage if you prefer. Okay, next, we need to generate all the possible alternatives and solutions. Now, if you were doing this in real life, you'd probably come up with way more solutions than we're going to consider now. For example, you might say, okay, well, if you're in this department, you can be hybrid. If you're in this department, you have to be in person all the time. Or you might say, let's consider different hybrid situations. Maybe it's 4 days in the office, 1 day hybrid, or 3 and 2. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, but we'll just simplify it for the purpose of this example. We'll say in-person, remote, and hybrid. Okay, now that we have our possible alternatives and solutions, we have to evaluate them. And the way that we do this is by saying, okay, out of 10, 10 is the very best, possible solution for employee productivity. So for in-person, what are we going to give it? We might say, okay, actually studies show that employees are a little bit more productive when they work at home. And that can be depending on the work, right? It's not for everybody. But so you'll say, okay, we'll give it an 8. For employee morale and retention, people actually really like working from home. They don't like being forced to come in all the time, so we'll give it a 6. It does not help us attract talent. We'll give that a 2 out of 4. Operational costs, we can save some money, but we're not doing it if we're in person, so we'll just say that's a 4 out of 6. Collaboration and innovation, though, it's great for that, 9 out of 9, and it's really great for company culture, 8 out of 8. And then you're going to do this for the other columns as well. You're going to consider remote work against all those criteria and assign scores. And you're going to assign scores for the hybrid column as well. Finally, once you've evaluated all these alternatives, right, you have some numerical data to work with. Now you just compute the optimal decision, and you just add up these columns and look at the scores. And one score hopefully will be higher, and for us it's hybrid. So for us, hybrid seems like it might be a really great option. You'll be able to take this process and use this with problems in your own work or with examples from class.